The question of what Lucifer looked like before the fall persists, not because Scripture describes him in detail, but precisely because it does not. Viewers and readers inherit images shaped by art, poetry, and later theology, yet the earliest biblical texts remain strikingly restrained. This documentary begins by stepping away from inherited imagery and returning to the ancient sources themselves, texts composed in worlds where appearance was communicated through metaphor, rank, and symbolic language rather than physical anatomy. If you value careful historical reconstruction over myth, this is where the evidence actually begins. In the Hebrew Bible, there is no character introduced as Lucifer in the modern sense. The name itself emerges from a later Latin translation, not from the original Hebrew text. What exists instead are poetic passages, prophetic taunts, and symbolic visions that describe figures associated with brilliance, height, and cosmic order. These descriptions were never intended as portraits in the modern visual sense. They functioned as literary tools, intelligible to ancient audiences familiar with royal ideology and celestial symbolism. Ancient Near Eastern cultures did not describe powerful beings by listing facial features or bodily proportions. Status was communicated through light, precious materials, elevation, and proximity to the divine realm. Kings were compared to stars. Deities were described as radiant. Celestial beings were associated with polished stone, fire, and luminescence. When biblical authors employed this language, they were participating in a shared symbolic vocabulary rather than offering eyewitness accounts. One of the most frequently cited texts in later tradition is a prophetic poem originally directed at a human ruler. In its ancient context, the passage mocks a fallen king by comparing his rise and collapse to a celestial body that once shone in the sky. The imagery is deliberately ironic. It elevates in order to humiliate. The figure is described in terms of brightness, ascent, and sudden descent, not to describe a supernatural anatomy, but to dramatize the reversal of power. The Hebrew term often translated as morning star or shining one refers to a visible astronomical phenomenon familiar to ancient observers. It conveyed brilliance and prominence, not personal identity. In royal propaganda across the ancient Near East, rulers were compared to stars precisely because stars were markers of order, timing, and divine favor. To lose that status was to fall from the heavens metaphorically, not physically. Understanding this linguistic environment is essential. When later readers isolated such passages from their historical setting, they began to read them as literal descriptions of a primordial being. But the original audience would have heard political satire and theological warning, not biography. Appearance in this context meant perceived glory and authority rather than physical form. The Bible consistently avoids anatomical descriptions of heavenly beings. Angels are messengers, not bodies. When they appear, they do so in forms that facilitate communication, sometimes human-like, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes deliberately ambiguous. The lack of physical detail is not accidental. It reflects a worldview in which the unseen realm is defined by function and rank, not flesh. Even when splendor is emphasized, it is conveyed through materials and light. Gold, gemstones, fire, and brilliance signal proximity to the divine. These elements appear repeatedly in descriptions of sacred spaces, priestly garments, and visions of the heavenly realm. They form a symbolic language of holiness and authority. When later interpreters applied this language to a singular fallen being, they were extending imagery beyond its original scope. At this early stage of the biblical record, there is no unified figure combining rebellion, evil, and a detailed pre-fall appearance. Instead, there are fragments, metaphors of light, critiques of pride, and warnings about overreaching power. These fragments were never assembled into a single portrait by the authors who wrote them. That synthesis occurred much later. What can be responsibly said, based on the earliest sources, is limited but clear. Before any notion of a fall, the imagery associated with exalted celestial status emphasizes radiance, elevation, and symbolic beauty. These qualities are not visual traits in the modern sense. They are indicators of position within a cosmic hierarchy understood through poetry and ritual language. This distinction matters. To ask what Lucifer looked like before the fall is already to impose a later framework onto ancient texts. The sources instead invite a different question. How did ancient writers express the idea of supreme status, and how did they communicate its loss? The answer lies not in faces or wings, but in light extinguished, heights abandoned, and authority withdrawn. As the narrative progresses, later Jewish and Christian traditions will begin to reinterpret these ancient symbols. They will connect separate texts, moralize poetic imagery, and gradually shape a figure whose appearance becomes more concrete in the imagination. But at the starting point, within the earliest biblical world, appearance is inseparable from role, and beauty is inseparable from status. This foundation is critical. Without it, every later description risks being misunderstood as ancient when it is, in fact, interpretive. The story of Lucifer's appearance does not begin with a body. It begins with language. To move beyond later assumptions, the investigation must return to the language of the earliest texts and the world in which that language functioned. Hebrew biblical authors did not write in abstraction. They employed a symbolic system shared across the ancient Near East. Terms associated with light, dawn, and shining were not aesthetic descriptors, but signals of cosmic order and authority. When such language appears, it points to status within a hierarchy, rather than to physical appearance. The Hebrew word, often rendered as shining one, belongs to a family of terms used for celestial bodies, visible at specific times. These bodies governed calendars, agricultural cycles, and ritual timing. In royal ideology, rulers aligned themselves with these lights to claim legitimacy and divine favor. To describe a figure as radiant or elevated was to associate that figure with stability, order, and sanctioned power. This linguistic framework explains why brilliance is repeatedly emphasized, while form is absent. Ancient audiences did not expect heavenly beings to possess bodies comparable to humans. Instead, they understood such beings as manifestations of divine function. When light appears in biblical texts, it frequently marks the presence of authority, rather than an object that can be visually inspected. The association between exalted status and brightness appears across multiple textual genres. Psalms, prophetic poetry, and wisdom literature all use luminosity as a metaphor for righteousness, wisdom, or divine proximity. Darkness, conversely, signifies disorder, judgment, or withdrawal of favor. These oppositions structure meaning without requiring physical description. Crucially, the later personalization of these metaphors alters their original function. When brightness becomes the trait of a named being rather than a symbol of rank, interpretation shifts from poetic critique to narrative identity. This shift did not occur within the earliest layers of Scripture. It emerged as texts were reread outside their original political and liturgical contexts. The ancient Near Eastern background reinforces this reading. In Mesopotamian literature, divine and semi-divine figures are described through materials and radiance rather than anatomy. Lapidary imagery, gold, polished stone, fire, signals sacredness and authority. These descriptions shaped expectations about how the unseen realm was spoken of, even when no visual form was implied. Within this world, to ascend meant to rise in status, not to move spatially through a sky. To fall meant political collapse or loss of divine endorsement. These metaphors were intelligible precisely because they were abstract. They conveyed meaning efficiently within cultures accustomed to symbolic speech. When biblical authors employed this language to critique pride or illegitimate authority, they relied on shared assumptions. The audience understood that no literal star had rebelled, just as no literal mountain had spoken. The imagery functioned rhetorically. Later readers, separated by centuries and unfamiliar with these conventions, increasingly treated metaphor as narrative description. As a result, the question of appearance began to drift. What was once symbolic brilliance became imagined beauty. What was once status became form. This development marks a turning point in interpretation, but it is not yet present in the earliest texts under examination. At this stage, the evidence supports a restrained conclusion. The biblical language that later traditions associate with Lucifer describes exaltation, visibility, and authority through metaphor. It does not describe a body, a face, or a recognizable physical being. Appearance, as understood by the ancient writers, was inseparable from cosmic role. This distinction will become increasingly important as later Jewish literature begins to press these symbols into more concrete frameworks. Only then does the idea of a describable pre-fall appearance begin to take shape, not from Scripture alone, but from interpretive expansion rooted in new theological concerns. The next layer of evidence emerges from prophetic literature that employs exalted imagery to describe figures associated with power, guardianship, and proximity to the divine realm. These passages are often detached from their historical settings in later readings, but within their original context, they function as theological commentary on kingship, order, and transgression. Their language is dense with symbolism, drawn from temple theology and ancient royal ideology. One such passage describes an exalted figure adorned with precious stones, positioned in a sacred space associated with divine presence. The imagery is not incidental. In the ancient Near East, gemstones, gold, and finely worked materials were markers of sanctity and legitimacy. Priestly garments, temple furnishings, and royal insignia shared this visual vocabulary. To describe a being clothed in such materials was to locate that being within the sphere of authorized power. Importantly, these descriptions mirror priestly symbolism rather than mythic anatomy. The focus is not on bodily form, but on function and placement. Sacred stones signify mediation between heaven and earth. Ordered arrangement signifies harmony within the divine system. When such imagery is applied to a figure who later falls, the contrast emphasizes loss of role rather than corruption of physical beauty. The prophetic texts themselves are not concerned with identifying a supernatural rebel. They address human arrogance by framing it within cosmic order. By elevating a ruler's status rhetorically and then stripping it away, the text dramatizes the danger of self-deification. The celestial language intensifies the warning without requiring a literal heavenly narrative. Ancient audiences understood this mode of speech. Kings were described as shepherds appointed by the gods. Temples were imagined as meeting points of heaven and earth. To speak of a ruler as once standing in a divine garden or sacred mountain was to highlight privilege, not origin. The fall described is ethical and political before it is theological. This is where later interpretation becomes decisive. When readers began to isolate these passages from their immediate polemical targets, they became available for broader cosmological speculation. The symbolic guardian of order was gradually transformed into a primordial being whose fall predated human history. With this shift, imagery once tied to office began to be read as description of essence. Even so, the language itself resists literalization. The precious stones listed correspond closely to priestly vestments and temple decoration. The sacred mountain reflects cosmological geography common in ancient religion. These elements point inward to cultic symbolism rather than outward to a physical portrait. Within this framework, appearance remains a secondary concern. What matters is position. Who stands close to the divine, who bears responsibility, and who loses it. Radiance and beauty signal legitimacy. Their removal signals judgment. The texts do not linger on how such a being looked, only on what such a being represented. By the end of this stage in the tradition, the building blocks of later imagery are present, but they are not yet assembled into a unified figure. The language of splendor, adornment, and elevation exists, but it functions within moral and institutional critique. The leap from symbolism to biography has not yet occurred. Understanding this prevents anachronism. To read these prophetic descriptions as literal accounts of Lucifer's pre-fall appearance is to miss their original purpose. They are not windows into the unseen realm. They are mirrors held up to human ambition, framed in the highest imagery available to the ancient imagination. Only in later interpretive environments, where texts were read together and harmonized across genres, would these images begin to coalesce into the familiar idea of a radiant being whose beauty preceded rebellion. That development belongs to the next stage of the story. Beyond the biblical texts themselves, the visual culture of the ancient Near East provides essential context for understanding how exalted beings were imagined without being physically described. Reliefs, seals, and temple art from Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant consistently portray divine or semi-divine figures through symbols of authority rather than individualized features. Wings, radiant discs, elevated platforms, and symmetrical posture communicate function and rank, not personality or anatomy. These images were not portraits in the modern sense. They operated as visual theology. A winged figure did not imply a biological creature with feathers, but a being associated with movement between realms. Radiance signified divine sanction. Elevated placement indicated hierarchy. The purpose was legibility within a symbolic system, not realism. This matters because biblical authors lived within this visual environment. Even when Israelite religion rejected images in worship, it did not exist in cultural isolation. The language of Scripture reflects familiarity with the same symbolic grammar seen in surrounding art. When texts describe beings as covering, standing, or shining, they echo visual conventions that communicated role rather than form. Protective figures in Near Eastern art often appear stationed near sacred spaces, thrones, or trees of life. Their appearance is deliberately standardized. Individual traits are suppressed to emphasize their function as guardians of order. This provides a parallel to biblical descriptions of exalted beings associated with divine presence. The emphasis remains on placement and duty, not individuality. In this context, any attempt to reconstruct a unique physical appearance for a pre-fall Lucifer runs against the grain of ancient representation. The cultures that produced these texts and images did not prioritize such detail. To them, specificity of form would have distracted from meaning. What mattered was what a being represented within the cosmic structure. The frequent association of exalted beings with polished stone and precious materials further reinforces this point. In ancient thought, such materials were not decorative, but symbolic. Their durability, rarity, and reflective quality made them suitable metaphors for permanence and divine order. To describe a being in these terms was to elevate its status, not to describe its skin or clothing. Modern viewers often misread this symbolism as literal description, because later artistic traditions trained audiences to expect individualized forms. Renaissance and medieval art, in particular, reintroduced naturalistic bodies into sacred imagery. These visual traditions then fed back into popular assumptions about what ancient texts must have meant. Archaeology, however, pushes in the opposite direction. The older the material, the more abstract and symbolic the representation becomes. This trend aligns with the biblical restraint observed earlier. Both text and image point to a shared assumption. The unseen realm is intelligible through symbols, not through anatomy. When later interpreters asked what Lucifer looked like before the fall, they were asking a question foreign to the ancient sources. The sources themselves answer a different question. What position did such a figure occupy, and how was that position communicated? The answer lies in radiance, elevation, and association with sacred space. At this stage, the evidence converges. Textual language and visual culture agree that exalted beings were defined by function and status. Appearance, as a modern category, simply does not apply. Any reconstruction that insists on physical detail risks importing later artistic imagination into an earlier symbolic world. This realization sets the stage for a significant shift. Only when Jewish literature begins to narrate heavenly rebellion more explicitly does appearance begin to harden into something closer to form. That development reflects changing theological interests rather than continuity with the earliest biblical worldview. A notable transition occurs in the literature of the Second Temple period, when Jewish writers began to explore the heavenly realm with greater narrative detail. Texts from this era expand earlier biblical imagery, not by contradicting it, but by filling perceived gaps with explanatory frameworks. These writings reflect new theological questions shaped by exile, imperial domination, and intensified concern with cosmic justice. In these sources, Rebellious heavenly beings are no longer implied solely through poetic critique. They become actors within structured narratives that explain the presence of evil, disorder, and corruption in the world. Importantly, even here, physical description remains limited. What increases is not anatomical detail, but clarity of rank, function, and transgression. When appearance is mentioned, it is tied to role. Heavenly beings are described as glorious, luminous, or terrible, yet these terms function as indicators of authority rather than bodily shape. Splendor corresponds to proximity to the divine order. Its loss corresponds to moral failure and exclusion. The logic remains consistent with earlier symbolic language, even as narrative form becomes more developed. Second Temple texts frequently organize the heavenly realm hierarchically. Beings are classified by task: watchers, messengers, guardians, accusers. Their appearance signals their position within this system. Brightness marks legitimacy, darkness marks displacement. The descriptions do not invite visualization so much as evaluation of status. This period also introduces the idea that heavenly beings could change condition. A being once associated with light may become associated with judgment or confinement. Yet this transformation is described in moral and spatial terms, not biological ones. The change is one of standing within the cosmic order, not of physical mutation. The growing interest in heavenly rebellion reflects historical pressures. Communities experiencing injustice sought explanations beyond human politics. The language of fallen celestial figures provided a framework for understanding why the world appeared misaligned with divine intention. These narratives expanded older metaphors without abandoning their symbolic core. Crucially, none of these texts offer a detailed portrait of a singular figure later identified as Lucifer. Instead, they speak of categories of beings whose fall results in diminished glory and restricted movement. Appearance remains secondary to accountability. Even when terror or beauty is emphasized, it functions rhetorically, reinforcing moral consequence. This restraint is significant. It demonstrates that even in a period more willing to narrate the unseen realm, authors resisted the impulse to concretize form. The heavenly world was still conceived as ordered, symbolic, and governed by function rather than flesh. By the end of the Second Temple period, the conceptual groundwork is laid for later synthesis. Symbols are more tightly linked to narrative identity. Rebellion is more clearly articulated. Yet the essential pattern holds. What a being looked like before falling is inseparable from what that being represented within the cosmic system. The question of appearance remains unresolved by design. The sources prioritize meaning over imagery. Only in subsequent interpretive traditions will this restraint give way to more defined portraits, shaped less by ancient context and more by theological and philosophical development. Early Jewish interpretive traditions approached exalted heavenly beings with notable caution. Commentators and translators working within inherited scriptural frameworks resisted collapsing symbolic language into fixed identities. Their concern was not to map the unseen realm visually, but to preserve theological boundaries between the divine, the angelic, and the human. In these traditions, beings associated with accusation or opposition are defined by function rather than origin. They operate within divine permission and remain subordinate to cosmic order. This framework leaves little room for elaborate descriptions of pre-fall beauty or form. To describe such a being too concretely risked granting it undue autonomy. Exegetical works from this period consistently prioritize role. When splendor is mentioned, it signals appointment. When it is removed, it signals loss of authorization. The transition is administrative, not physiological. The language remains abstract by intention. This restraint reflects deeper theological commitments. Jewish monotheism emphasized the uniqueness of the divine and resisted mythic elaboration that blurred boundaries. The unseen realm existed, but it was tightly regulated in interpretation. Angels were not demigods, they were instruments. As a result, the question of what a rebellious figure once looked like rarely appears. When it does, it is framed as a change in standing rather than substance. The focus remains on obedience, not origin. Even when later readers attempt to extract biography from these texts, the sources themselves offer little support. This interpretive posture delayed the emergence of a singular fallen figure with a defined appearance. Instead, the tradition maintained ambiguity. This ambiguity was not a gap in knowledge, but a safeguard against speculative theology. Only when interpretive communities faced new philosophical and doctrinal pressures did this balance begin to shift. The next stage of the story reveals how early Christian writers, reading the same texts in a different context, began to assemble a more personalized figure from these symbolic fragments. Part 7. Early Christian writers inherited the symbolic language of the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple literature, but they read these texts through new theological lenses, shaped by debates about evil, free will, and cosmic rebellion. In this environment, older metaphors began to converge. Passages once understood independently were read together, creating a more unified narrative framework. The shift was subtle but consequential. Language that had described fallen kings, corrupted authority, or disrupted order was increasingly harmonized into a single story of primordial rebellion. The figure later called Lucifer emerged not from a new text, but from the alignment of existing ones. Appearance, however, remained largely symbolic, even as identity became more personalized. Christian authors emphasized moral contrast. Pre-fall splendor was described to heighten the seriousness of the fall itself. Radiance represented proximity to divine truth. Its loss represented separation. These descriptions were not meant to invite visual reconstruction, but to underscore ethical consequence. The influence of Greco-Roman philosophy also shaped interpretation. Abstract qualities such as beauty, harmony, and order were associated with goodness. Disorder and corruption signaled moral failure. When Christian thinkers spoke of a once glorious being, they employed philosophical categories rather than visual detail. Beauty functioned as a metaphysical concept, not a physical one. Even so, language began to harden. Where earlier texts spoke of light as status, Christian writers increasingly treated it as an attribute. This did not yet produce a body or face, but it moved interpretation closer to imagining a describable being. The emphasis remained inward, on will, intellect, and alignment with divine order. Importantly, these writers still avoided concrete physical description. Wings, faces, and forms appear rarely and inconsistently, often inherited from visionary literature rather than doctrinal exposition. The focus remained on transformation of condition, not transformation of shape. By this stage, the idea of a pre-fall Lucifer as supremely radiant had taken hold, but that radiance was moral and ontological rather than visual. It described what the being was within the structure of creation, not how it would have appeared to human eyes. This period marks a turning point. The symbolic language of earlier traditions was now being read narratively and morally, setting the stage for later generations to ask visual questions the texts themselves never answered. The groundwork was laid, not by new evidence, but by new ways of reading old words. By the medieval period, interpretation entered a decisively new phase. Theological reflection was now deeply intertwined with philosophy, systematic doctrine, and inherited artistic tradition. Earlier symbolic language, once flexible and restrained, began to crystallize into more defined conceptual models. It is here that modern assumptions about Lucifer's pre-fall appearance take their most recognizable shape. Medieval theologians were less concerned with the original historical settings of biblical texts than with their coherence within an ordered cosmology. Heavenly beings were classified according to intellect, function, and degree of participation in divine light. Within this framework, pre-fall Lucifer was understood as occupying an exceptionally high rank, often associated with perfection of intellect and proximity to divine illumination. This intellectual hierarchy encouraged descriptive language that sounded increasingly concrete. Beauty became a marker of metaphysical completeness. Light became a measure of knowledge and purity. Yet even here, appearance was still not anatomical. It was philosophical. To say that Lucifer was beautiful before the fall meant that his intellect was ordered, his will aligned, and his participation in divine truth complete. At the same time, artistic tradition began to influence theological imagination. Visual representations of angels became more humanized, reflecting broader cultural shifts toward naturalism. These images did not arise from scripture, but from artistic convention. Over time, they fed back into popular theology, giving visual form to concepts originally expressed abstractly. This feedback loop is critical. Once images existed, they shaped how texts were read. Radiance became visible light. Exaltation became spatial height. Symbolic language was reinterpreted through the lens of art. The result was a gradual conflation of metaphor with form. Yet even medieval theologians acknowledged the limits of such imagery. Many insisted that angelic beings lacked material bodies and could not be seen as humans are seen. The visual language was pedagogical, not descriptive. It served to communicate hierarchy and moral truth to audiences accustomed to concrete representation. By this point, the question of what Lucifer looked like before the fall had effectively changed meaning. It no longer asked how ancient texts communicated status. It asked how a metaphysical being might be imagined within a structured universe. The answer depended less on scripture and more on philosophical synthesis. This development explains why later tradition speaks confidently of pre-fall beauty, while remaining vague about form. The certainty lies in status and perfection, not in physical traits. The appearance is inferred from rank, not observed. As interpretation moved further from its ancient roots, the distance between text and imagination widened. What began as poetic language about authority and loss became a narrative of splendor and ruin, increasingly visual in the cultural mind. Modern readers often inherit this final stage without realizing how late it is. The next step is to disentangle these layers. Modern scholarship seeks to separate ancient meaning from medieval synthesis, not to discard tradition, but to understand its construction. Only then can the original question be addressed responsibly. Modern scholarship approaches the question of Lucifer's pre-fall appearance by reversing the medieval process rather than extending it. Instead of asking how the figure has been imagined, researchers ask how and when those images entered the tradition. This method prioritizes textual history, comparative linguistics, and cultural context over inherited theology. Critical analysis distinguishes sharply between ancient texts and later interpretive syntheses. Passages once grouped together are examined independently, within their own historical and literary settings. When this is done, the coherence of a single, visually defined pre-fall being begins to dissolve. What remains are separate traditions addressing power, rebellion, and order in different ways. Scholars emphasize that no canonical biblical text describes the physical appearance of a rebellious angel before a cosmic fall. Where splendor appears, it functions symbolically. Where elevation is described, it reflects status. These features align with known ancient conventions rather than with later narrative expectations. Comparative study reinforces this conclusion. When biblical language is placed alongside Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and West Semitic texts, the patterns are consistent. Divine or semi-divine figures are described through light, precious materials, and spatial metaphors. Physical form is either absent or deliberately standardized. Individualized beauty is a later concern. Modern interpreters also note how translation history shaped perception. Terms associated with brightness or dawn took on new resonance when rendered into later languages that favored personalization. Over time, linguistic nuance hardened into identity. What was once descriptive became nominal. This process explains why popular portrayals feel ancient while lacking ancient support. They reflect centuries of interpretive layering rather than original intent. Scholarship does not deny the theological value of later tradition, but it separates that value from historical reconstruction. As a result, responsible academic conclusions are modest. The sources allow reconstruction of status, role, and symbolic attributes. They do not permit reconstruction of facial features, bodily form, or visual beauty in a modern sense. Any such image belongs to later imagination, not to the biblical world. This restraint is not a limitation of evidence, but a feature of the texts themselves. Ancient authors communicated meaning without inviting visualization. Their silence on form is intentional. It preserves the transcendence of the unseen realm and prevents its reduction to spectacle. At this stage, the inquiry reaches a critical threshold. The accumulated evidence points consistently in one direction. To ask what Lucifer looked like before the fall is to ask a question shaped by later tradition, not by ancient sources. The final task is to articulate what can be said with confidence, and to acknowledge what cannot, without dissolving either history or meaning. When the layers of tradition are carefully separated, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The biblical and early Jewish sources do not present a recoverable visual portrait of Lucifer before the fall. They do not describe a face, a body, or a form that could be rendered with physical accuracy. What they preserve instead is a language of position, authority, and symbolic brilliance, shaped by the intellectual world of the ancient Near East. In that world, appearance was not a matter of anatomy. It was a matter of meaning. Light signified legitimacy. Elevation signified authority. Precious materials signified proximity to the sacred. To look glorious was to occupy a sanctioned role within cosmic order. When that role was lost, the imagery inverted. Light was withdrawn. Elevation became descent. Beauty gave way to exposure and humiliation. These were not visual transformations, but theological judgments. The figure later called Lucifer emerges not as a character with a describable body, but as a convergence of metaphors drawn from royal satire, temple symbolism, and cosmic hierarchy. Each source contributes a fragment: brilliance from astronomical imagery, adornment from priestly language, downfall from prophetic critique. None of these fragments were originally intended to form a single biographical account. Later traditions, especially within Christian theology and medieval philosophy, assembled these elements into a unified narrative. In doing so, they shifted the meaning of appearance from symbolic status to imagined form. This shift was driven by new intellectual needs: the desire for systematic cosmology, moral exemplars, and visual pedagogy. Art then reinforced theology, and theology reinforced imagination. Modern scholarship does not negate these later developments, but it places them where they belong. They are interpretations, not origins. They tell us how communities understood evil, pride, and rebellion in their own historical moments. They do not tell us how ancient authors envisioned a fallen angel's body, because that was never their concern. What can be said with confidence is therefore precise and limited. Before any notion of a fall, the being later identified as Lucifer was associated, in symbolic language, with supreme status, radiance, and authorized presence within cosmic order. That appearance was not something to be seen, but something to be recognized. It described what the being was, not what it looked like. The enduring fascination with Lucifer's pre-fall beauty reveals more about later readers than about ancient texts. It reflects a shift from symbolic thinking to visual imagination, from function to form. The sources themselves resist this shift. Their silence is deliberate, disciplined, and consistent. In the end, the most accurate answer to the question is also the least sensational. The Bible does not describe what Lucifer looked like before the fall because it was not interested in bodies, faces, or spectacle. It was interested in order, authority, and the consequences of pride. Any image beyond that belongs not to Scripture, but to history's long conversation with it.